There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Exodus. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. But here, now, in the wilderness, the only safe place was at God's altar. But none of these laws could ever be used to mitigate anyone who intentionally committed a premeditated murder. So if you committed a premeditated murder and you go up there and you start hanging on the altar, that wouldn't be protection for you. So if you fled to the altar after committing a murder, all they would do is they would just rip you away and they would execute you. They'd just take you out and stone you to death. And then we get to verse 15 and it says, "He who strikes his father or mother shall surely be put to death." And you might think, well, gosh, that's pretty extreme. That's pretty harsh for just a kid hitting his parent. But striking a parent here is to be taken in the context of he who strikes a man so that he dies. So this is a person who has just tried to murder or attempted to murder one of his parents. And so his punishment would be death. So his punishment would be capital punishment. And then it goes on and it talks about kidnapping. And kidnapping in our country, it used to be a capital crime. It used to be a death penalty offense. And you may think it should be still because of all the sex trafficking and that type of kidnapping. But most of the kidnapping that occurs in our country now is parental kidnapping, where someone takes and holds a child without the consent of the other parent and guardian. But in the ancient world, most of the slavery commonly occurred from kidnapping. So it's like that story of Joseph and his brothers in the book of Genesis when they sold them to go down to Egypt. And so this wasn't to be permitted in Israel, because what this is a theft of a human being. This is a theft of a soul, and all souls belong to God. And then we go on and we read that not only striking a parent is a death sentence, but also a child who curses a parent is a death sentence. And so again, we would say, wow, this still seems very extreme. These laws are very strict. And you can see there is absolutely no mercy ever written in any of these laws. And so these strict laws, they were to be used as to be a deterrent, to be able to demand respect in the family, because the breakdown of the family is the beginning of the undoing of any society. And that was not going to be tolerated in Israel. But again, the idea of cursing a parent here is the idea of a child threatening his parent, like making a death threat. And then when we get to Deuteronomy 21:18, we'll find that it wasn't the parents who had the right to be able to carry out the sentence and the death of their child. They couldn't just go kill their kid because their kid just talked back to them. But they were required to take their child in front of the elders, the judges of the cities, to be judged in sentences. And one thing that you never read is you never read about the sentence ever being carried out in Israel. But God is serious about children respecting their parents' authority. And then you get down to verse 18, and now it starts to talk about striking someone when it doesn't kill them, but it creates this great bodily injury. So now if the person is struck and he lives for 2 days, they won't be charged with murder. But that person will still be civilly liable for that person that they struck. They'll be charged for their doctor's bills and their lost wages, everything until he heals from that injury. But here we see that even if this was a man's slave, and this is actually talking about a slave. This is not talking about a Hebrew servant, because a Hebrew servant wasn't to be treated like a slave. But it tells us here really plainly that this servant is his property. So if an owner and he beats his servant, be it a male or a female, and that slave dies, that owner will be punished. And what that's saying here is that he will be punished as a murderer, that owner will be put to death. And this is not like any of the other cultures of that day, where an owner could kill his slave for anything, because a slave was only property. But God, he doesn't see slaves as just pieces of property. He sees all people the same, all human beings, all of us. All of us are created in the image of God, and all of us have basic human rights. But if that slave, if he lives for 2 days, the owner won't be punished, because that means that it wasn't a premeditated murder. Because if he really wanted to kill his slave, he would have no trouble doing it. So this would prove that his motive wasn't murder, and he just loses his property. And where it says here, it says, he is his property, it literally means he is his money. So that just talks about the slave, that the slave was just his investment. It was just like having money. And then we get down to verse 22 about a pregnant woman. If she gets injured in the middle of a man fighting with her husband, and that baby is born premature and has no injuries, well, that's fine. And this man, he'll only get fined. He'll only have to pay the husband an amount of money that's agreed upon with the judges. And this word for judges here is not like the same word we read for judges earlier. This is not the word Elohim. This is the word pilim, which means an arbitrator or a meditator. And it actually looks like the word we have for like prelim. But if this baby dies, now the penalty is death. And that shows us that God sees these babies as human lives. And this is where it says, life for life. And so it really doesn't matter what the culture says. God sees human life from the very beginning, from its very conception. And when you look at this, and you look at this case, this here is not a premeditated murder. This injury was not intentional, but God still holds this man accountable. And he holds him accountable with his life. And then this verse goes on and it says, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burned, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And there's a lot of people, they'll look at this law and they'll say, wow, that's so barbaric. But it's actually the very opposite of being barbaric. What this is saying is that the punishment, it has to fit the crime. It would have to be equal. No more, no less. And this all had to be done through the judges. And sometimes this is taken out of context, where they would say, well, that guy's hand was injured, so you have to injure that other guy's hand. But that's not the intent of this law. The intent of this law was to set limitations on how much you could require. It's on how far can you go? So it can't be like, well, you broke my hand, so I'm going to poke out your eyes and make you blind, because that would be escalating in your retribution. That punishment would not fit the crime. And you think about that. You think, like if your son or something accidentally knocked out your tooth, you wouldn't want to go knock out your tooth. He's your son. You love him. And so this is not saying if you lose a tooth and it, you have to go knock out the other person's tooth. This is saying if it's someone's fault, you can't go further than requiring a tooth from that person. So it wasn't a requirement that you had to take an eye or a tooth. It's just as far as you can go. And then you have to remember that Jesus, he prohibited this type of justice for his disciples. They weren't to retaliate against the people who wronged them, but they were to turn the other cheek, where the disciples were commanded not to exact personal revenge when injured, but they were commanded to forgive. Where a believer here, he can waive his legal rights to be able to bring glory to God. Okay, now you get down to verse 26, where that principle for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, that law did not apply to the slaves. So if it happened between a master and a slave, and that slave, he lost a tooth or he lost an eye, they were freed from their slavery. So this is a lot greater than vindication or a restitution, because a master, he may have the right to a slave's labor, but all people are equal in the eyes of God. And all people ultimately belong to God because we're all made in God's image. So this owner, he doesn't get his eye pulled out or his tooth knocked out, but he loses the right of the use of that slave forever. And this probably kept a lot of slave owners, very careful about how they treated their slaves. And then we get to verse 28, and it starts to move into these laws regarding animals. And it talks about an ox goring a man or a woman to death. And an ox in this culture was more than just having a cow or a bull to have some beef. If you had an ox, it was like having a tractor. An ox was a tool for you to make money with, to plow the land. And not everybody had an ox. So if your ox killed someone, it's saying it had to be stoned. So what it's saying is like, this ox has to be executed. And so this is a public execution of the ox. You just couldn't slay the ox and go have a steak dinner. There could be no profit for the owner here from this ox. But there was also no punishment for the owner. But that's only if the ox owner didn't know that he had a mean bull. Because if he knew he had a mean bull that chased people and he didn't keep it confined for the safety of others, and if there was any kind of negligence on the part of the owner, he had known about this ox, and there was proof that he knew about this ox, well, then the ox was stoned to death, but the owner was stoned to death with him. But this owner, he could actually buy his way out of this execution if the other party who lost a loved one would take money for the compensation of their loss. And you can see here that this compensation is applied equally to any family member here. So it didn't matter if it was a son, it didn't matter if it was a daughter, an adult, or a child. It was always the same rights. They all have the same value to God. It wasn't just for the adults. But if it was a slave, there was a fixed price. And that fixed price was 30 shekels of silver. And that's where we get the price of where Jesus will be betrayed for. Jesus was betrayed for 30 shekels of silver. He was betrayed by Judas for the price of a dead slave.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.